In this video, we're going to talk about different types of sampling methods. To start, I want to point out some bad sampling methods. The first is something that's very common when people do samples, and that's what's called a voluntary response or self-selected sample. Anytime you see something like a poll on a website or when a radio station calls or asks people to call in and give their opinions, this type of sample is called a voluntary response, meaning that whoever wants to be in the sample can be. It can also be called self-selected, meaning that the sample is sort of selecting itself. People are choosing to be in the sample. This is generally not a good way of sampling because for one thing, you're only going to be getting, for example, the people who are listening to the radio at that moment, or the people who happen to be reading that website or interested in that website. Another problem with this type of sample is that you tend to get people with strong opinions. If you put up a poll asking about the death penalty, the people who respond to your poll are more likely going to have extreme views on the death penalty, either be very for it or very against it. People who don't have extreme views likely would just pass over the poll and choose not to participate. More broadly than this, we have just convenience samples. And this could be a voluntary response. It could also just be, say, asking all of your friends or interviewing people in your classes, or anytime you're choosing a sample just by convenience because it's easy to get that data, that would be considered a convenience sample. There may be some cases where that's the sort of sample you want to have, either because it's too difficult to get a more random sample, or just because the results are not that important. But in general, these types of samples are not good because they're not representative. When we pick our sample to do a study, we want that sample to be sort of a little microcosm of the whole population. So if you're interested in studying, say, everyone who lives in Colorado, but you only ask the people you're friends with on Facebook your questions, those people that you're friends with might have characteristics in common that are not reflective of the whole population. Maybe they're more likely to agree with you, or maybe they're more likely to be in a certain age range or something like that. So when we're looking for a good statistical study, what we're looking for are what we call probabilistic sampling methods. Probabilistic here meaning that these samples are chosen with some sort of randomness. They're not just selected based on a particular characteristic. So the most basic of this type of sampling method is what's called a simple random sample. A simple random sample is sort of the most basic, but it's also, in many cases, the most difficult to actually get. A sample is called simple random if any group of the population with a certain size is equally likely to be chosen. So for example, if your population is Red Rock students and you're choosing a sample of size 10, that means that any 10 students are equally likely to be chosen. So this is completely random. And it's difficult to actually get samples like this, but one way you could do that is, for example, Red Rock students, if you could make a list of S numbers and then use a computer to choose those at random, that would be a simple random sample. Any group has equal probability of being chosen. On a more basic level, pulling numbers out of a hat would be an example of a simple random sample, since any or names out of a hat, any group of those are equally likely to be chosen. The next option is what's called systematic sampling. And with systematic sampling, we're looking to choose every kth member of the population. So for example, if you have an assembly line, you might select every 100th part that comes across to be part of your sample, maybe checking for defects. Another example, if you called every 30th phone number in the phone book, or if you stood outside of a supermarket and asked every 10th customer, if you were trying to survey customers of a certain supermarket. That would be considered systematic sampling. The last two types of sampling are somewhat similar, so we want to be careful not to confuse the two. The first is called stratified sampling. With stratified sampling, we want to take the whole population and split it into groups called strata. So for example, we might take the population of voters and divide it up by age group. Or we could split a population up by gender, for example. Once we've split up the population into groups or strata, then we want to take a sample from each group, and this would usually be at random. So we select a certain number of people, say 100 people from each group, and that total would be our sample. This method is particularly valuable when you're trying to examine characteristics of a population, maybe based on the ethnicity of people and whether that affects whatever you're measuring. If you wanted to do a drug trial, for example, you might want an equal number of men and women to be participating, and so you might use a stratified sample. The last one is a cluster sample. With a cluster sample, we're again going to take the whole population and divide it into groups. These groups are called clusters. And then we're going to select some of these clusters at random. So I only have 5 here. Maybe I'd select 2 at random. And everyone or everything in those clusters that are selected would become part of the sample. So again, with stratified, we're picking a certain number from every one of the groups, and with cluster sampling, we're taking all of each cluster. So for example, if you wanted to interview members of churches in the US, you might not be able to get a list of all church members, but we might be able to get a list of churches, and so maybe we select 100 churches at random and then survey everyone in each one of those churches. That would be a cluster sample. You can also have combinations of these, but these are sort of the basic types in sampling methods that we're interested in here. All right, to finish up, here's a problem for you to work on. Classify each sampling method described as simple random, systematic, stratified, cluster, or convenience. Some of these you may have to justify. Depending upon your perspective, they might be one or another. That's all for this video. See you next time.